This episode of The Cauldron, we have Rhea Dempsey. Rhea is a former PE teacher turned childbirth educator and counsellor, and feels privileged to have attended more than 1,000 births in hospitals and home settings as a birth attendant, as well as connecting with many more women, their partners and support people during birth preparation workshops and personal counselling sessions. Rhea has spoken extensively around Australia and internationally, and is the author of 2 books, Birth with Confidence, Savvy Choices for Normal Birth, and the most recent, Beyond the Birth Plan, Getting Real About Pain and Power. Rhea's thoughtful, gentle voice takes us on a look back over the world of birth from the past 40 years, from England to Australia. How Rhea's own hospital birth and subsequent home birth led to her passion into childbirth education and birth attendant work. She tells us how home births were parties back in the day, and Rhea talks with us about how sadly in more than 40 years of birth work, she's witnessed an unprecedented rise in unnecessary medical interventions and the development of a culture that, rather than supporting women to birth naturally, physiologically, is actually undermining them. We discuss the fucking epidural, as Rhea terms it, and how she feels it has hijacked what labour and birth discomfort means, the thank goodness births, and what this means for society. And we discuss the importance of what it is we choose to focus on when providing childbirth education. We look at attachment styles and how that impacts how we go into birth, and how shame plays a role in how we may or may not ask for help. But beautifully, Rhea leaves us with an oxytocin-fueled story from her book, and makes me, Katie, cry. So do up your shoelaces, or put the kettle on, put the keys in the ignition, because this is a long episode, but you're going to really enjoy it. I'm Katie James, and this is the Midwives Cauldron podcast. Each episode, I'm joined by my incredible co-host, Dr. Rachel Reed. Listen in as we hubble, bubble, toil and trouble our way through aspects of womanhood, midwifery, birth and lactation. So go on, subscribe now, and hear us on your favourite podcast host. But just a sec, before we start on this epic episode, if you love the show and want more from Rachel and me, then head on over to our websites and check out all the courses, books, collectives a go-go. You'll find all the details and occasional discount deals on the old Instagram at the Midwives Cauldron, or, of course, in the show notes below. And if you really, really love the show, please consider 2 things: a single or a monthly donation over on Patreon, or even buy me a coffee. And remember, that review you leave on your podcast host really makes a difference in who listens in. Thank you for your support. We just love having you bubbling away with us. Rhea Dempsey, welcome to The Cauldron. It is an absolute pleasure and a treat to finally get to meet you and to speak to you in our bubbling pot. I am thrilled. Thank you.
So thrilled to be here, talking some of the good juice about birth here.
Oh, that's exactly what we want. So let's get started, because we've got a short time and I know there's a huge amount that we could talk about and probably keep you here all day. But for our audience, can you tell us about your journey to the matriarch of birth world that you are today?
Yeah, well, it's started in England, where you two, I think, know one another from, and certainly anybody would know from the accents that they hear when you're speaking that that's the case. So I had my first baby in London at the Whittington Hospital, which I have since found that it's become one of the more progressive hospitals with some brilliant obstetricians in there really trying to shake it all up. But pity they weren't around when I had so that daughter, my first daughter, is now 45, coming 46, I think. So I'm Australian, and I was a phys ed teacher and an outdoor adventure facilitator, and very much in my body and very much trusting my body and feeling like, well, bodies can do all sorts of things. And so I was quite naively, probably arrogantly, naively feeling like, well, it's just going to be so simple to have this baby. And anyway, without going through all of the bits and pieces, but of course, pretty well anybody in the know would know that that's a bit of a pipe dream even back then. So this is 45 years ago, late 70s, that that idea about it just being very straightforward and having, back then, of course, we talked about natural birth. Natural birth. And really it started to go wrong when we phoned the hospital because my membranes were leaking. We phoned the hospital and they sent bells and whistles and the whole thing, an ambulance to pick me up and deliver me to the hospital.
Wow.
So that sort of took me out a little bit, as you can imagine. So I'm thinking this is all fine, normal, but they're obviously thinking this is something a bit troubling. When I got there in the sort of early hours of the morning, and the midwife who was on was absolutely brilliant. She was a West Indian midwife, I think, with beautiful, rich voice. And I mean, you could just surrender to her voice. And she did a vaginal examination. She said, "Oh my heavens, you're 6 centimeters dilated. So we won't need to do this enema or the shave or the whatever."
All the good stuff they did back then.
All the good stuff they did back then. Anyway, from then, with a whole lot of people coming in and what have you, obviously put me off my, well, as I understand now, just changed my entire hormonal process, and things stopped from then. And then my husband was with me, and then we were just badgered and, just treated very badly through the rest of that night into the early morning, as I now know, till when the hospital woke up at about 7:30 or so in the morning. But at one point, because, they wanted to put a drip up because it all slowed down and what have you, and kept refusing that. And at one point, with such frustration, presumably on the part of the staff, that they punitively then said, "Well, if you're not going to bother to do this, well, I mean, we just can't deal with you here anymore." So they pushed me down on the trolley and put us into the sort of ante room to the pan room. So we're sort of shoved there out of the way, and not really facilitative of surrendering to that labour getting going again. And then when the hospital woke up, I mean, I wouldn't have used this language then. This is just what I've understood through doing far too much birth debriefing and hearing these stories over and over and over again. That through the nighttime, it looks like everybody feels like everything is fine, but then come 7:30 or so in the morning, "Oh no, you haven't been doing anything, and we need to do this, this, and this, and this." Yeah. So that's what happened. Eventually, the drip put up, and then baby born quite quickly after that. And it was still at the time when you laboured early labour in one space, and then when you're pushing, rush down the corridor to another space, and then stirrups and the whole deal. And she was born, lusty, taken off, of course, straight away, and it was a young guy. Now I would think must be just a new obstetrician student doing his thing anyway. Injection for 3rd stage and then delivering the placenta, but the cord broke. So then a code was called. I might cry here. a code was called. So the cord broke, the placenta still inside, and so then a manual removal is done. But the key thing about this that is so distressing to me still this day was that when that code was called, and I don't really understood what that was, neither did my husband, but he was bundled out of the room. And he was bundled out of the room and just sort of left in the corridor beside the door, where all of these people were rushing in, of course, because of the code. And he, later on when we connected and so on, and we're talking through over the next few days about what had happened, and he was in such distress because he didn't know what was going on, but what he heard was a few people, as they were rushing into the room in response to the code, one asked the other, well, do you know what's going on in there? And one said, no, I don't really know what's going on. I just heard that there's a woman bleeding out in there.
Oh gosh.
So he, not knowing anything else, of course, is feeling,
Yeah.
So, anyway, baby all back together, baby born and so on, a day or so in hospital. But then one of the things that probably set me entirely on the path of still now, all these years later, being so passionate about birth and still talking so strongly about some of these issues was before they started to do, the hospital got in touch with obviously a lot of people and said they started to do some childbirth education at the hospital. So we went along. So it was like in a lecture hall with an obstetrician giving a lecture, and there must have been like 100 couples there.
Oh gosh.
Like just
wow. Can you imagine?
So it was more or less sort of telling us what, but I had heard, and there may be other women listening to this that, I'm sort of in that sort of arrogance of feeling my body works and that it will all be fine. And so not really understanding what I know now, that you've got to be very careful about where you're choosing and so on and so on. But there are a few people around me, a few women around me who'd had their babies and who I realise in hindsight were sort of subtly trying to wake me up with various comments that they're saying. And have you found out about this? And have you found out about that? But I was like in just a whole naive, I don't know, dream. And but I do remember from one of the women that was around me said, well, have you do you know what do they do episiotomies, or do they do do you know anything about this? And I'm like, oh, you don't need to know anything about this. This baby's just going to fly out of me. So anyway, of course I had an episiotomy. In the postnatal ward. So it was in the times when it was a large ward, 12 women, 10 of us in beds with the curtains around, and then 2 other more partitioned rooms. And I was in there for maybe 2 days, 2 nights. And of course, there's a great camaraderie, actually. The babies, of course, were off in the nursery, only to come out when it was feeding time. So we had a lot of time sitting around, and there was quite a lot of, anyway, just sort of quite good fun of things in that way that, I don't know, maybe in times really where there's trauma or there's great distress, that thing about bringing humour to the situation can be very settling and supportive and making a community. So that was going on. Anyway, I started to think about the epidural, and so I decided, I asked all the women in the section that I was in, the 10 beds, sort of opposite one another and what have you, who'd had an episiotomy. All of us. So I'm thinking, well, it just hit me like a what the fuck? And then the other thing I found out was in the 2 other rooms that were slightly, they were part of this big ward, but they had a little bit more privacy around, like partitions, and they'd had Caesars. So all the women who had vaginal births had a epidural, a episiotomy, and then the 2 Caesars. First of all, I think in that Now you could swing those numbers around totally the other way, yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
10 Caesars and the 2 vaginal births with whatever. But it's like I mulled over that. It's like it shocked me. And then I was wondering, what is it? Because at the childbirth education, I had gotten up my courage and asked him this big thing, do you do routine episiotomies here? Asking this obstetrician. No, we don't do routine episiotomies here. No, we don't do things routinely here and whatever. So then when I find out, it's like, this isn't adding up. What is going on here? So I started to wake up and then became quite radicalized very quickly, I think. So we had her. There's more to that story too, but that's enough at the moment. You get the feeling. And then I'm Australian. My then husband was English, so we had always planned pretty well as soon as we had the baby to come back to Australia. So we did that. And I was very lucky to have a few friends of mine so we came back here when that baby daughter was 4 months old. And then just people around me, a few had home births. There was a birth centre here in Melbourne already at that point, and women were coming from interstate to come to this birth centre here. So I just had friends who were tapped into that scene. Such a blessing, yeah. So I didn't have to really go hunting. But certainly I'd gotten to the point of feeling like, I don't trust hospitals. I don't trust where they're coming from. I'm not going back there. So we had the plan was for a home birth. And at that point in Melbourne, in Victoria, I think probably this was the case across Australia, but home births at that point were supported by GP obstetricians, and not all GP obstetricians, but a few GP obstetricians. And we didn't really have a history like in England of midwives in that way of going and doing home births. So it was the GP obstetricians, and then just a few in the end of me, as well as other women who'd had a home birth. And then next thing we're sort of, I don't know that we ever called ourselves lay midwives, but we certainly weren't doing midwifery. A bit more like the gossips, experienced gossips who had these sorts of births and were then, so it started then going to births. And that was the case for some years in the home birth scene, until a number of the midwives who had been trained and were working in hospitals were starting to come into the home birth scene. And anyway, various other political things that eventually changed, and midwives then could. Rachel, no doubt you've talked about all of those things over here, the political stuff, but midwives then being much more fully engaged, not so much then with the GPs and so on. So I got involved then. Had my second baby, beautiful, straightforward home birth, a few little tricky bits. But in those days, the early home birth days, at least here in Melbourne, I mean, they were just parties. Like there were 12 people at that birth.
What? Well,
we lived in a share house. We had the friends who we lived with, they're all there. Then there's a few other women who'd had home births before and with their kids. So there's 12 adults, maybe even more, with a few more kids. I mean, it was just a party. Most of it was just a party. And in fact, when she was born, and I'd gone really sort of deeply within, so in that space just really with me and my baby and my partner there, my husband then. And after she was born and falling in love with her and just that whole sort of attunement to that quite tight circle of the baby, partner, me. I don't know, how long does that take, and you're just falling eye-to-eye contact with the baby and all of that stuff. Anyway, at some point I look up and the room is filled, like there's people just all around the edges of the room. And my 2-year-old daughter was in the arms of one of the women was there especially to look after her and to have her. Anyway, but there was just that like reverence to that situation that I wasn't, because I mean, to think about having 12 people, well, of course, freaking out. But this is like if you were in a hospital and you had 12 people who were in there, that would be quite a different story. This is just a beautiful holding of that space.
How wonderful.
With a reverence to what is happening and not calling any energy towards them, but offering energy into that bubble, that oxytocin bubble that we now know about.
Mm.
So that gives me goosebumps now when I'm
me too.
That. Yeah. So that was a very healing story. I had, though, before having my own first home birth, I'd been invited mainly in home birth scene, but invited because I had that little 2-year-old and the few women whose births home births I went to before I had my own home birth had little toddlers and what have you. And so I was invited to bring the childcare along. I.e., so that the kids could be playing with one another while all this is happening. But do you know what a lot of those second babies do? They don't care to wait for anybody.
Oh, no.
They don't care to wait for who's supposed to be there. They're just on their way. And so I had that great privilege of being the one who was around at that point and receiving those babies. So that's 2 of those before I then had my own home birth. So, I mean, actually, you're not going to stop doing this ever, 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 are you?
Once you've witnessed that magic and been present to that, it's pretty darn special.
Pretty darn special. So then, again, my own babies, and then so around the home birth scene, then I decided that I would go and become so I was a teacher beforehand, physical education teacher and so on. I thought I'm going to go and be a childbirth educator. So I went and did that training for a year. And then with the CEA, Childbirth Education Association, I guess a bit like the National Trust in that. Okay. The National Childbirth Trust, was that what it was called in England?
Yep.
So a bit, not the same, but a bit similar to that. And so started teaching classes and loved that. And again, most of the couples who would come to that particular independent classes, in fact, I don't think they were even really doing classes in the hospitals at that point. That organisation really stirred things up quite a lot. And so then they started to do classes in the hospital. But the couples who came there were, what I now would call willing women who are really wanting to have a go. This was in the late 70s, and again, natural birth. So I did that for many years, thinking that that's what I was going to do. But then another little baby of mine jumped in, another girl, 3 girls, and so another home birth a few years later in 81, and that was another beautiful home birth. Not the whole. My sister was there, and pretty well the GP got there pretty well as she was crowning. And mainly it was just us. We lived in a share house, but people didn't. The others weren't really involved. It more or less happened in the very early hours of the morning. So another beautiful birth. The 2 siblings there to welcome her. In fact, they're very bonded, those 3 daughters of mine. And there was a beautiful moment where that 3rd daughter, her head, she sat on the perineum, her head worn for quite some time. My then husband and the girls were saying, "Oh, she's got her eyes open. She's got her eyes open." So they're having this interaction with her, and she just
yeah. So
her dad stroked her head. Her older sister stroked her head, and then it was like, but her second. So there's a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and so my second daughter, as seeing the interloper just about to come into her life. Stood there watching with her arms very tightly closed behind her back. You could just feel that energy, like I'm not welcoming this kid into. Anyway, it was like we all waited, and next thing she did stroke her, and immediately she just felt like there was that energetic permission given, and then she tumbled on out, and they're a beautiful, beautiful trio, that three. So anyway, the rest is history. Probably there's more things maybe to say, but that's what brought me into this birthing world. Became a childbirth educator and so on, and continue to be at births. And I guess as trained midwives were coming into the home birth scene and the GPs were dropping out, then not that the word even was around at that point, but I guess now people would call what I was doing at that point really being a doula in that sort of situation. So in a team with the midwives, and they would be watching over the medical stuff. I would sort of be a bit more into the emotional and psychological aspects of it, and beautiful, beautiful births, hundreds of births through all of that time. Some in hospital, lots of home births, and how wonderful. So those three daughters of mine have had, so there are 5 grandchildren that I have now, all homeborn, all born at home. 2 of them more or less exactly where I'm sitting here. And one, I don't know if you can see over as far as the couch, but over the other side, one over there. So this is a sacred space, this.
Isn't it?
Baby's born. And the other 2 born at home, but in the parents' home, when they did have their own homes. So there we are. And as well as that, not only my own daughters and their births, but I've had the privilege of being at all of the babies in the next generation in my whole family.
Wow. That's pretty special, huh?
Wonderful. So anyway, that's how I've gotten involved in birth.
And here you are now, having written
here I am now.
2 incredible books as well.
Yep.
And we'd like to pick your brains about your latest book. You have Birth with Confidence, and your most recent book, Beyond the Birth Plan.
Nice weighty book.
Yes.
A weighty book.
And I just want to read out the chapters because I love the chapter headings, and I think it kind of really encapsulates preparing for birth. So you tell your story, and then we've got the system, the woman, her caregivers, her history, her fears, her yearnings, her partner, her healing. And I love it because I think childbirth education tends to, not always, but certainly at mainstream and definitely in hospital settings, focus on telling women how their bodies work, what options there are for all the amazing things that are offered in terms of medications and interventions, where to park your car when you come into the hospital.
That's an essential.
Maybe how to change a nappy. But they miss that holistic kind of really psychological preparation that is actually the foundations. The other stuff doesn't matter. And you just capture that beautifully in this book.
Yeah. Well, so the Childbirth Education Association, so we were doing not exactly the same as I would now, because times have changed anyway in terms of what women have to be mindful of to give themselves half a chance in the birth culture. But what I started to do quite early on was, as well as doing the couples, and the couple stuff at that point was like 8 sessions, like 8 evenings, once a week over an 8-week period or something. So lots of time for building relationships and going deeper with things. But then I started to feel, particularly around the home birth scene and so on, and started to do weekly women-only circles. So pregnant women. And that was partly So Active Birth had come through at that point. Jennifer Laskus, thank you. That was like just one of those books that dropped into like a bit of dynamite into, because even those of us at home births, in the early home births, we're still sort of half lying on our backs and on our beds So that dynamite came through. So I was then doing childbirth. So these women's sessions were partly some of the sort of exercises and positional things that came out of Janet's work. But plus also we would just sort of talk, like a circle, and share where we're up to and what's going on and what choices and so on. So that went on one way or another in a few different settings. I did those women's circles for pregnant women for maybe 30 years.
Wow. And what major changes did you see over that time?
Okay, so what was happening? Well, God, we're going to be here all night.
Just give me the key ones.
Yeah. Can I just say that what then happened was, so that was the pregnant women, but then they formed such a beautiful support network for one another. And also, of course, they all wanted to hear what the birth stories were. So then tacked onto that would be once a month would be everybody come back who's had their babies and tell their birth stories. Mm-hmm. And then I also was doing a weekly postnatal class with all the babies, and the babies could come until they started crawling. Then they weren't allowed to come anymore because it was far too disruptive.
Absolutely.
So this went on for years and years and years, and so much. We could call it childbirth education, but really that's providing a situation, and all the women are educating one another.
Absolutely, it's like a community.
The thing that I would most love watching was when the women who'd been in the pregnancy circle with their hopes and dreams and plans and then have their babies, and then they would come back on this once a month telling the birth story, which also had the postnatal women. So there's little babies. So the mums are there with their babies, and if the baby needs to be fed, they'll just whip the baby on the breast. If they just need to have their nappy changed, they just do that in the circle and what have you. Everybody all relax. But the pregnant women who haven't yet had their babies, they're just like, would be how it would be in our if we were living more communal lives, but to be exposed to that, like they're just totally can't believe their eyes what they're seeing. So all of this is education.
Absolutely.
Saying anything, without saying anything. Anyway, that happened, and then there was the couples work that I would do in terms of the couple as well. So it was quite a lot of education in a number of different sort of settings. Some women only, some couples, some so on. It's brilliant. I had to give all of that up in order to be able to write these books.
Yeah, but I'm glad you did.
Yes. Also, so much of what I've learned comes out of that deep immersion in women's stories and women's reflections and women's, those sparks of awareness that they have when they hear somebody else's story, and then that bounces off on what they understand and so on. And we go in deep because it feels safe to go in deep and to understand those things. So thank you, Rachel, for making that mention about that book and going down that pathway and drawing it out as childbirth education, because so much of that comes out of those years and years of being in circle with women and hearing.
And there are lots of stories in the book. You weaved stories throughout.
Yeah. So to go back to the question you asked about the things that have changed, so many things, but there are a few key things that have changed, which I lament. I feel like some of these things that have changed. So, for instance, the epidural.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a particular term for the epidural.
No, as I've come to call it, the fucking epidural.
That's the one. Good. Glad we got that out of you.
We had to have that in the podcast.
Absolutely. I needed to hear that. Can you say that again, please, Rhea?
The fucking epidural.
There we go.
So I can talk about it like this because I was around in the birth scene before the fucking epidural existed. Or maybe it existed, but it wasn't existing in the birth scene. Yeah. So again, I'll cry, because one of the things that means is that privilege of seeing in the main. I mean, you know, they were still interfered with a bit if you're in hospital and so on, but there was an expectation that it's some hard work. You know, you're doing some work and you're going to work and you're going to work and have your baby. And so there was no mindset about comfort. The idea of labour and birth and comfort just did not go together. It wasn't a cultural hijacking of something about that particular energy. When the epidural started to come, those of us who are working in that, particularly the home birth scene, the birth centre scene and what have you, we did welcome them in because we had no foresight. What we saw was, you know, just sometimes in some of those births where if that baby's really in a difficult position and it's long and it's very hard, those epidurals can be just brilliant in that situation. What I didn't have any awareness about what would happen was that they would hijack the entire mindset about pain and not pain but comfort, change that entirely, and also not have insight into just what they do in terms of changing physiology and changing birth just to a total other story. So, and I don't know anywhere that it was probably up high in the sky to think if we'd been on the case about it and talked about it a bit more before it really got a hold. It's never, you know, we wouldn't have been a hold back the tide. But so now I see that. But those of us who've been around for long enough before epidurals come in, I think we've got to talk it up a bit, because we've had a lot of privileged experiences that many, many midwives and couples are not having now, because it's so, you know, that idea of comfort, that idea of once you start to not feel comfortable. And also, I mean, based on that, you know, Liz Newman's great book that she did with those two Irish midwives as well about, she called it, came out a few years ago, just before. Anyway, all the stats about epidurals and the work that she did here in South Australia, which I have quote a lot of in that book. So what we have coming out, so back to the things that have changed, what we have coming out of, I think not entirely the fucking epidural, but in large part the fucking epidural, is that idea of comfort, and that the point at which women shift from doing the things that they think can keep them comfortable, like being in a tub far too early in the labour, or particular breathing that will somehow or other keep it comfortable. And of course, when they get to a point where it's not comfortable, well then, because you're supposed to be comfortable, well then the epidural comes in. So that's become such a norm, and because not enough people are talking about the downside of the epidural, so the epidural to me just seems like it's hijacked the whole story, and it's done it in such a way where the true ramifications of that are not talked about, partly because I think it's not only that we've got this ideal of comfort, but we pity labouring women. Poor things. Poor things, they have to do that hard work. Poor things, and so therefore they have the right to be comfortable, and if we have a way to make them comfortable, then we can't denigrate that too much and talk about what all the other consequences are, because that's the sort of higher good, is that they're comfortable, that this epidural can do that. It might fuck the labour. The baby might really not like the epidural, but it's comfortable. And hear my passion about it. I mean, all the birth debriefing, far too much birth debriefing, weeping.
Yeah.
So the epidural, can I go through the thing? Can we talk about just a little bit about the things that? So I just have written them down here because I didn't want to miss out on any bits. Yeah. So of course we have the Caesar rate is gone up threefold with the epidural. So now maybe I'm going to put this in a different way. This is the way I talk about it in my childbirth education. I talk about the thank goodness birth, which is what we're hearing all the time. The thank goodness birth.
Oh yeah.
I hear about the thank goodness birth in my birthday briefing. They come in to be birthday briefed, but thank goodness anyway, I was in that hospital, and thank goodness that, they could save the baby, and thank goodness. And anywhere, asking, have you heard about that? Yeah, thank goodness birth. So people who are uninformed, couples, women, they are taking on board all of these stories about thank goodness they could save the baby, thank goodness they could save me, without putting in the missing piece of the puzzle, which is basically usually the fucking epidural. So I warn all the women that I'm working with, or whatever, that if you're hearing anything, because of course, thank goodness births come at you all the time. Like pregnant women that get those stories coming to them all the time. And they're so generally thank goodness birth. So what that does to the pregnant woman is, of course, it freaks her out in terms of, oh my God, birth is so dangerous, women's bodies don't work, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Without, I warn all the women that I work with, you've got to unpack. If you hear a woman talking to you about a thank goodness birth, just subtly, gently ask, oh, where did she have the baby? And how did she go about this? And what did she do about pain relief? And did she have an epidural? And then that helps to dismantle something of the sort of raw fear that come out of just hearing thank goodness birth after thank goodness birth after thank goodness birth, and thinking that that is a true reflection of how dangerous birth is. And that, women these days don't have the capacity to birth, and or babies are imperiled, which is not a good way for women to hear, or pregnant women to hear that, because it is undermining of their own trust. So this is a big thing that's changed, and this is a big cultural change as well as practice change. So to just go back through this list, so threefold increase in Caesars with epidurals involved, sevenfold increase in vacuum and forceps. If we got that, we of course know that means lots more episiotomies, lots more tears, and if there's an epidural up and they're using forceps or vacuum, they can use much more power and pressure and so on. So the pelvic floor is really not doing too good in that situation, but the mother is comfortable. During, yes, later. Of course, the need for the mum with the temperature, baby then turns. So then sometimes, well, certainly babies on antibiotics or having to go to special care or what have you. Well, thank goodness we've saved the baby.
Absolutely. But what about the breastfeeding and the skin to skin and
yes, please,
the microbiome and
breastfeeding, exactly all of that. Then another one of my pet things, which is again still linked to the epidural, but it's linked more generally. So there's much more understanding about the physiology, and there is more talk, and some of it so beautifully informed by our darling Sarah Buckley. And Katie, I'm not sure if you're aware of this. I'm pretty sure, Rachel, you'll be aware of it, but us Aussies, if somebody's born in another country but they do brilliant things here, we claim them as an Aussie.
Oh, so I'm well aware of that. Absolutely.
So, I mean, Rachel is true blue, yeah. She's done some good work here, but she comes from somewhere else. And Sarah comes from New Zealand, but we don't let that worry us. We claim her. So she's doing all that brilliant work. And so there's lots more understanding. But what I hear and see and witness is that in terms of discussions about labour, we use the term oxytocin, whether it's naturally occurring oxytocin or it's synthetic oxytocin, that is not differentiated in much of the conversation. But of course, we know that they're very different response, different effects and different story. And I'll tell you a story here about this. So many things I'm going to cry about because. So I talk about in my childbirth education, I talk about the difference between queen oxytocin, which is the oxytocin coming from the mother and the baby, and from all of us who are attuned and all that, oxytocin is just in that birth space and we're all falling in love, because we know queen oxytocin is a multitasking multitasking wonder of a hormone, kind of, attend and befriend and so on. And in terms of birth, yes, drives the big contractions, get the baby born, but also opens everybody's heart to receive the baby and for all that bonding and so on. We know that synthetic oxytocin, different forms of it in different countries from what I can gather, but apparently, according to Sarah, it has the same chemical signature as queen oxytocin, but of course doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, so we don't get any of this glorious human mammalian capacity for social engagement and falling in love and bonding and nurturing and so on and so on. None of that happens. But we can get the baby born because we can drive the contractions. So this is a huge thing to make, I think, in my childbirth education, to clarify that, so that they're not just thinking, well, they put
it's
up
the same thing.
You can do the same effect.
Yeah, all the same effect.
Man-made.
Anyway, I remember one time I was at a giving a particular class for somebody else's childbirth education series, and talking about making this difference about queen oxytocin and synthetic oxytocin, and giving the stats about what's happening in Australia here in terms of induction, elective Caesars, augmentation, and so on. I mean, there's about, I reckon, 1 to 5, and managed third stage. In Australia, it's not in the stats, actually. You've got to try and tease it out. And I reckon there's maybe about 1 to 5% where mums and babies would get full complement of queen oxytocin in their birth. Very, very, very small. And queen oxytocin, separate to what it does in birth, is also the hormone of love and nurturing and compassion and tend and befriend in the community.
Yep.
I've got skin in the game. I've got 5 grandkids. I want them in the playground to be surrounded by all sorts of other kids who have got all their queen oxytocin systems switched on, so that they're all tending and befriending and loving and caring and nurturing and what have you. But it's not what's happening with them. Because, I mean, there's lots of social commentators now talking about, separate to even COVID, but talking about that thing about that we're losing the capacity for empathy in culture and communities, that we're losing that capacity to be very tending and caring for other people and so on, which are all mediated through queen oxytocin, or queen oxytocin has been behind this. We know with that beautiful work that Sarah's doing, and Eustace Moberg and what have you, around the oxytocin receptors and what can be passed from the mother to the child, and so through the generations. We also know that oxytocin is at the core of, at birth we talk about as bonding, but then of course as the baby grows and the relationship grows, we talk about it as attachment, and how important attachment is at the psychological level, the emotional level, and the well-being level for any of us as we move forward in our lives. And so at this talk, we're talking about how we're fucking with queen oxytocin. And this dad came up after the talk. He came up to me. He said, Rhea. He said, I must talk to you. He said, I'm an attachment researcher. This is attachment through, the longer span of life. Which, if I remember correctly, in that third book, second book, it's in chapter 3 that I talk about this, so important. But he said, I'm an attachment researcher. There's not that many of us in the world, and we're all in contact with one another. And what we've been noticing is that, X number of years ago, I forget when he said, but there was a huge change from high rates of secure attachment to the rates of insecure attachment starting to come up. He said, we were thinking, why is this? Why we're researching? Why is this the case? He said, we thought it was probably had something to do with childcare, shifting from extended family care for childcare to different forms of childcare. He said, but, he grabbed me. He said, but none of us think about birth. We have no idea about what is happening in the birth space. He said, he was just about in despair. He said, I can't believe this. I said, so.
It just shows, doesn't it? Really, that attachment researchers wouldn't even think to go back to those, fundamental early beginnings, preconception, during pregnancy, and the birth experience, and then the bonding from that absolute moment, and how that will play a role throughout the rest of our lives.
Yes.
And yet we understand that with animals. Everybody knows that with animals, you don't,
Completely.
the attachment happens at birth and you don't mess with it. Otherwise you have the baby getting rejected.
Exactly. And that you do everything you can so that queen oxytocin is running that show in terms of opening the body, but also is switching on the mother and the baby to fall in love with the bonding.
Yes.
So I worry. I do worry.
Yeah.
On that. And these things that I worry about, I talk about lots as well. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk here. So the epidural is part of that story, because when we put the epidural in, of course, then that slows all the queen oxytocin down. So then we have to put up synthetic oxytocin and la. So it's quite depressing.
It is depressing, but it's great that we have someone like you and a lot of people out there putting a huge amount of work and effort into the importance of this preparation for childbirth, for this transition into motherhood. And I think sometimes this can be overlooked about the importance of it. And particularly, like Rachel said, and you've said, in the hospital system, we go through these very specific things that, God, we need to tick off the tick list of the car parking fees, for example, and that you'll get your money back because you're in labor. But talking about these in relation to not just the process of birth and not just the immediate first few days and the breastfeeding, but also how our children grow up and how we interact is of vital importance. And your books are really talking to that, which is fantastic. And we need to know why it is important in this modern birth culture of that childbirth preparation, of being aware, of being enlightened to what's happened before, is so vital. And that's what you've been able to talk to. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And you include how the patterns of attachment for the woman alter how she will approach and experience birth, which is, a really interesting thing to consider.
Yeah. So it's not only really in terms of trying to protect normal physiological childbirth so that we get that full complement of the mammalian hormones that then can be expressed in relationships, and that the babies get caught, captured and nurtured within that, as well as having all those hormones active in their own selves. But yeah, so that thing about, I would think, the idea about attachment and attachment styles is around that when we're in a threat situation, first of all, our attachment style sort of develops through those early few years. They talk about up to about 3 years. And it's all happening within the sort of memory banks of things, not so much our clear timeline of, I remember this happened and this happened and this happened, but just into that deeper sort of levels of consciousness of just being laid down, how it all feels. And that our attachment system, and if we think about ourselves as mammals, it's much easier when we think about other mammals and thinking about, if another mammal baby is left alone and not being held and not protected and not kept safe and so on, that they're imperiled. They're imperiled in a threat situation. And so that's when the attachment behaviors to try and get that good connect with somebody who can keep the older, wiser attachment figure who can keep us safe, whether that's the calf or the pussycat or the other mammals or us as humans, that when we don't have the capacity to keep our own selves safe, and particularly the human baby, we've got to be as dependent as any of the mammal babies, can't do too much to keep ourselves safe in the very early years. So we're dependent on that safety from that strong connect. And so the attachment, our attachment style is activated when we're in a threat situation. It's developed in our early years. It'd be beautiful for all of us, it was a secure attachment, because a secure attachment basically means that you feel like you've got your own resources, and that in all sorts of things in life, you've got, good solid resources within yourself to embrace this and embrace that and embrace the other. But if you're facing something that is more challenging and you're feeling that shakiness or that fearfulness or what have you, that with secure attachment, you know that you could reach out to somebody else who could give you the support you need. And the key factor being that you could reach out to that somebody else to give more support to you to deal with that thing. And you can do that without any shame. That you can feel secure in yourself, that you've got your own resources to do all sorts of things. Sometimes you haven't got enough resources to face this and face that, and without any shame at all,
and that's the
you can accept and reach for and ask for some support from somebody else who could help you through whatever that thing is. This is secure attachment. I mean, it's more complex than that, but this is one of the key things, and particularly in terms of birthing, I think. So insecure attachment, a few different types, but basically one of the key factors about insecure attachment is that threat situations, well, now we have to talk about the two main types. So one is the sort of anxious attachment. So this is where, in those early years where this is laid down, the child does get that beautiful connect that's required from the parent figures or the parents or the people who can help it. It does get it sometimes. It's not predictable when, but they are smart, those kids. They keep trying and keep trying and keep trying and keep trying, because they know eventually, sometime, it will work and the attachment figure will take care of me or nurture me or deal with this thing and so on. So that the anxious attachment, but what it means for the child, and if we go through to adult attachment, is that they stay in that anxious state of wondering whether at any point I will get the nurture and need and the support that I need, or I won't. And so they stay in a heightened state of looking for good attachment, never knowing whether it will be there.
Yep.
We translate that to birth. Man, Rachel, you don't have to worry about it. The epidural can take care of all of these things. Anyway, the anxious attachment. So that means, of course, heightened. It's more complex, of course, but, adrenaline is much higher in the body system and so on, which is not very great for birth and so on, so on. So women have got anxious attachment, as well as, it's a shameful thing anyway. It's a deep ground shame about to reach out or to ask or accept. So that's problematic. And then the other touch is the avoidant attachment style. So this is where the small baby, the child in those early formative years, they don't get the attachment they need. In any situation, they don't. They obviously get enough care to keep them alive, but they don't, in terms of this deeper level of self and being, don't get enough attuned care in those situations of danger or stress or threat. And so what those people do is they feel like they've got to shut down all their neediness, shut down all their fearfulness, shut down all their sense where they might turn to somebody else and be totally enough for themselves. And if they are in threats, well, of course, you're always going to sometimes be in a threat situation, but when they're in threat situations, it's incredible. It's entirely, totally shame-filled to be needy. Must be to myself enough. And to be in a situation of being needy of care or nurture or protection or what have you, this is just incredibly shameful. So anything to hide So in that chapter, and it's not only me, that when I started to write what has become the third chapter in the second book, which is the one we're talking about attachment, that's where I started. I thought, I'm not a writer. I feel like I've had all these privileged situations. It'd be good to tell some stories. I'm not a writer, but I felt like I wanted to, but I'd witnessed this about attachment. I've done counselling and psychology, and so I was putting this all together in the birth stuff, and I thought, I want to write about this. I thought the only way I'm going to be able to get myself engaged to do the work of writing is to really get into something that I don't fully understand myself and want to know more of and want to know how to express. So it was sort of the juiciness of that got me started. Then my eldest daughter, who's my editor, I think I did quite well to encourage her down the literary pathways, the darling. So really the second book was going to be part of a 10-chapter book. And the first book was going to be just those first early chapters, which I thought that's going to be so simple to write that, because that was my core of my childbirth education. So this attachment stuff was the first thing that I wrote. And when I came back to it many years later and started to write it as the second book, what I found is that there's quite a few researchers, some here in Australia in Melbourne, some pain researchers here at La Trobe Uni, who they're looking at not only attachment as it relates to pain experience more generally, but also in childbirth. So what I had been witnessing and had previously written about, now I've got research to back it. So that was good to have waited 10 years to get round to this book. So in terms of pain, not only a childbirth pain, but people with an anxious attachment, remember, who are always activating up in the ante, which means that hormones and so on. So they experience much more pain generally in life and more severe pain because of that connection. And people with avoidant attachment, then they do develop quite a lot of their own inner resilience. Yeah. But when it really gets tricky, then what the research is saying, what I would say is that the epidural is the perfect companion for the avoidant attached woman who, it's shameful if she is feeling vulnerable. It's shameful if she's receiving support. And of course, with the epidural, you can just play Angry Birds and not have to engage. So, and of course, the woman who's secure attachment has her own resources, but also is beautifully, lovingly able to drop into that nurturing from whoever the people are that she has with her to help to nurture. And that strong eye gaze, with that birthing woman, that labouring woman, and not all the time. I mean, they often have their eyes closed, but once they might need that, and that strong eye gaze from either the loving partner, but sometimes they can't hold it because they're freaking out themselves, but the midwife or doula or what have you can hold that space. And that eye gaze is, of course, one of the signature behaviours of attachment. So in the birth space, it's a bit of magic.
It is the magic. It brings me to two questions, if I may. The first is, if a woman is able to identify that she leans more towards anxious or avoidant attachment, what can she do? What would you be recommending? And the second question is, we'll get to that, obviously, hopefully, but I want to put it in before I forget, is also the impact of the birth worker who's with her and their attachment style and how that impacts on the woman. So I'm sorry, I've bombarded you with two questions there, but I wanted to get them out before I got whisked away and forgot the second one, because I would like to know both of them, so if possible.
So can I just say first off, I mean, if this wasn't important, if it wasn't important for us in our own, any individual human being about how they're going to be in their life and what support they're going to have around and what their connections are going to be, or for us as a humankind to have a sense about what all this attachment's about and how it all works. It probably wouldn't matter what goes on at birth. It does matter, I think. But separate to that, of course, we can take care of all of it. Both of those, I'll come back to them, but both of those questions can be answered by the epidural.
Yes.
Because then we're not in threat anymore.
Oh, this is like a sad laugh. Yeah.
Yeah. So the anxious attachment woman, to settle her down, the epidural, we often hear that language, don't we? A woman who's in a lot of distress.
Totally. And there's fear from the person who's watching that and witnessing it.
And it trucks the labour, but can settle it down. And of course, the anxious, the avoidant attachment, the epidural is just like such a gift. No shame, no being vulnerable, no exposing, that vulnerable self. Epidural takes that all away, and there are consequences in terms of how the birth unfolds and the baby's consequences there. But yeah, so we can take care of it. I'm not happy about the way we take care of it, mind you, but it can be done with epidural. But how might you, if you have a woman who wants to have a go, what I call a willing woman, a woman who wants to engage with her body, her baby, her physiology, and work towards that normal physiological childbirth. It's such a mouthful to say it, isn't it? We can't just talk about normal birth anymore because...
physiological childbirth. Yeah, it's a lot of syllables. Yeah, way too many.
A lot of them.
But important.
So, but we've got to name it because it's an endangered activity, so we better at least try and keep a name for it. So in that case, if a woman wants to have a go, then, if she has secure attachment, then she will know that this is a threat situation in terms of this is a big deal, and that she will seek out the people who will have some expertise for what she's wanting to do, and also who will have some solid support to give her, and she will have her own resources that she can use at sometimes. But if she needs to lean into somebody else more, she needs eye gaze at this point, then that's all part of that beautiful unfolding, which just keeps oxytocin flowing between and within, and so on. So yeah, great. Well, as long as she doesn't see her key attachment figure is an obstetrician, that's a different story. Yeah, hopefully her key attachment figure will be a midwife. If it's anyway, let's not get even further depressed about this thing by thinking about that. If it's anxious attachment, it's not only for the birth that this would be important for women and couples to be doing a little bit of work on this, because this is going to play out in terms of how they are with their kids, and then generationally this gets passed around. So anxious attachment women need to be, so the work they need to do, if we're just generally around birth, would be to strengthen some of the skill level that they could bring into the picture, so that I don't think it's necessarily any particular breathing technique, but certainly most of us need, what we do when we get into a whole lot of stress or fear or whatever, our breath gets hijacked and throughout what's going on with our hormones. So it's good to have any way to calm that down. So whether it's any sort of yoga breathing, whether it's any of the breathing techniques that people particularly practice, or it's that you have at some point in your life run and, have changed your breathing in order to settle yourself in any context, then knowing that that's something to be done, and that sometimes when things are very strong in the labour, sometimes you need somebody to be breathing with you to help that, to steady that, and so on. So to understand some of those things, to understand that they need calming presence. So, and they need, because the anxious attachment person is looking for that attunement, and it's when they can't get that attunement that really turns on this deeper anxiety where they keep trying and trying and trying, and to get noticed, and so what the attachment researchers and what I had witnessed, and the attachment researchers, it's like they keep hyperactivating the pain. So these are the women who appear very, very distressed in very early labour and so on. And maybe if those women are there, as well as getting their own skill levels up, that they would actually make sure that they've got somebody who knows what they're doing in that space as a good anchoring, as an attachment figure.
Mm-hmm.
And that, they've got that nurturing care so that they can be they're in touch with their own vulnerability. They're generally too much in touch with their own vulnerability, and they need somebody who can anchor them into a strengthened place. And that's often through breathing with them, or hold and eye contact and what have you, to help to settle them so that they can be more present in their body and continue with that. So that I'd be suggesting to those women that they do their pregnancy yoga classes, or they do some practices, but also that they wisely get somebody who's solid in there. And is that going to be their partner? It's the big question.
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I think in chapter 7 I talk about how that is with the couple relationship. So, of course, continuity of care, midwifery care, making that relationship, all of that, it's like a gift to these situations.
Absolutely. That's what seems to come out for me, what you're saying. And if they're not able to get that, where can they source that? And that's where doulas and birth attendants come in, of that relationship needs to have had some time beforehand, so that there is this trust. Also, there's this recognition from the birth worker to understand that woman's cues of I'm anxious, I'm seeking, I'm looking, I'm in a state where the stress is coming in, and it's being recognized, because when it's not being recognized, then it's going to cause that situation to probably get worse rather than better.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the avoidant attachment, from their point of view, they don't need anybody. So they're often not. It's a protective mechanism.
I imagine this is trickier to be in assistance with. Yeah,
it's a beautiful story I tell in what would be in that chapter 3. I mean, to just go a little aside for a moment, I mean, given where the birth culture is now, I think it's a bit much the same in England, or I don't know how this goes. You probably go worldwide, don't you, with this podcast?
Mm-hmm. We do.
Yes, how fantastic. Also, sadly, it's it's a few places where things are a bit better from our point of view, but a lot of this is happening. So in a way, unless in the birth culture itself, for instance, if we were to have continuity of midwifery care as standard care, some of this would be taken care of because women themselves wouldn't have to seek it out. Yeah, this would be what would be on offer. But because standard care is intermittent care, and so we'll all know that, so then these aspects about a woman's attachment style are much more activated. Am I making sense with that? That makes enough sense. Yeah. But given that it's not standard care, most women, if they have a avoidant attachment, whoever is going to be with them, because the avoidant attachment is probably like, oh look, this will be a breeze, I can really do this. Or either they're going to be, no, I'm going to have an epidural right from the start, or I can do it. There's not much in between. But then when they get to a point where if they're feeling like they're out of their depth, then it's shameful, right, to be showing that you're vulnerable, which is why the epidural is so helpful in that situation, stabilize the emotions, not for the birth. And on the other hand, if there is somebody in that circle who could be useful, they have certainly got to know that the mother wants to have a go. Like if you're going to draw her through that feeling of shame, or that feeling like I should be able to do it myself, or what have you, it's got to be quite clear that she wants to have a go at normal birth, normal physiological childbirth, which then gives some leverage to whether it's the midwife or the doula or the best friend, or I don't think the partner can do this. Well, maybe if it's another woman and she's already given birth herself a few times. But whoever might be able to witness the vulnerability of the avoidant attachment woman, the crumbling, the surrendering, the vulnerability, can witness that and has the green, what I call the green light, that knowing that this woman really wants to be supported through into working with this labour. It's very hard to hold that and take her through if you aren't very clear right from the start that that's actually what she wants. I would imagine this is similar in terms of breastfeeding.
Yes, I draw many similarities. And I think it's what you said, I think, is profound for us as working in this space. I think that the avoidant attachment is one of the hardest to work with, particularly if you haven't built a relationship. And even if you have, thinking about own personal friends who will not reach out for help, and you are trying to find a way to connect and love, and you come from a place where you don't see it as shameful to ask for help. We are all different and we're all dynamic in our thoughts and feelings, and it's a process. And I think when we are in this avoidant, we're already in that mindset of, I've always had to cope on my own. Why would I even reach out for a doula or continuity of care? So perhaps these women are not even seeking that pathway and are quite happy to just get on with it, so to speak. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, thank goodness that everyone was there to save me. It's challenging. It's really challenging. But I think it's a lovely thing to think about. And I think as when we're working in that space, to have a bit more of awareness about how we also are and what our attachment style is, and thinking about perhaps sometimes why there isn't a connection with the person that we're working with or the family in total, that's also like my mind's just buzzing right now, but I think it's something really important to think about.
Yes, you've got, I mean, given the way birth is going in so many places, you've got to have good, clear, green light sort of leverage from any woman about if you're supporting either as a midwife or a doula or whatever, to support them through the sort of tough gig of doing the work. And then if you could add the complexity of what the attachment styles are, then that's there too. So in terms of this one, the attachment styles, I think it needs to be, because yes, avoidant attachment woman is probably not going to reach out to have that person, whether it's the midwife that they're drawing in or a doula or what have you. They're not, no, because they've built up such a protective mechanism about being everything to themselves because it's too vulnerable to be not. So, but if we had continuity of midwifery care as standard care, as I say, then there's much more exposure to what that can be like. And that sort of continuity of care also goes through into the breastfeeding and so on.
And how amazing that the research continues to tell us that that is the case, really, and we continue to ignore that, and yet it affects so many facets of this entire journey that women are experiencing.
Exactly.
Rhea, I think this is a beautiful place to possibly close, because otherwise we'll keep you for forever. But I know that you would like to tell us one of the stories that is in your latest book, and I'd really like you to invite you to bring that for us.
Yes, I would love to read this story to you, because it just happened that I was at another social situation on Sunday, actually, and this couple were there with one of their children, and I've been with them for 3 of their babies. And so I was reflecting back on those beautiful births, and that I had they'd given me permission to use, their story, the story of their last baby's birth, in the book. So I just think I'd like to read it. So Rachel's story is in the last chapter of the book. And this is me telling the story. I'd had a few hours of sleep after a night spent in sacred birthing space with a woman, her partner, and their extended family, all welcoming the new baby boy. And that boy now is like in his late 20s, right? I'd been with this woman and her partner for the gentle birth of their previous 2 daughters, and here we were, all together again in the quiet late night hours, waiting. The 2 little ones sleeping upstairs. We had all known it would be in the quiet of night, for when else in the busy day with 2 active, bright girls would a mother find the head, heart and body space to let herself go into the potency of birthing her new babe? I arrived focused and attuned for the birth, having inwardly shifted gears, dropping off preoccupations from my own day and family happenings, centering into a quiet expectation, ready for any subtle or dramatic shifts that would alert me to the need for extra focus or activity. Another fine-tuning of my energy was necessary as I moved into the space. It required a merging, being careful not to interrupt, intrude, or jangle the flow, an awareness about how to speak, to move, and finally to touch. I'm just going to come out of the story to describe this setting. So, as I've said, the 2 little girls were upstairs, the mum and the dad are downstairs. There's a tub in the corner. There's plenty of space in the lounge room, for things to stand on and kneel on and lean on and what have you. But also in that birth space, 2 of the aunties of the birthing woman and 2 of her, like nieces, cousins, who were just beautiful singing. They sing in choirs, and so they were singing quietly in the corner. The grandfather of the baby is a classical guitarist, and I've been at quite a number of births where he's played classical guitar in the network of these sort of family systems. Wow. So he's over in another corner with the guitar, and the dad himself of this baby is also a guitarist, and so this is the gentle, beautiful scene to come into. Yeah, so she's in sort of still earlyish labour, with all this fire burning and so on. Mm-hmm. That's where we all want to be born, don't we?
Yes. Oh, tears in my eyes, Rhea. It's lovely.
Yeah. There was a loveliness in all the surroundings, creating the opportunity for feelings of lovingness. Now, there is no such word as lovingness. I think it should be in the Macquarie dictionary, because it's the word that I use to describe when you've got an oxytocin infused birth space, and everybody is in love with everybody else, and the whole vibe is that there's just so much lovingness in there that this baby is just going to come out and be love bombed, really, with all of that. God. And that oxytocin is in the air. All of that, we're all bonded. Creating the opportunity for feelings of lovingness to suffuse the environment, creating a safe space for the hard work of birthing. In this sacred space, Rach, after greeting with love and thankfulness all of us who came to be with her for the birth, moved into herself, into her body, and fully towards her baby. Birthing energy was high in the candlelit lounge, soft cushions, a mattress on the floor, and a tub filled in the corner. Sweet music was ringing, sometimes from the stereo, sometimes from grandmothers and aunties in heavenly chorus, and other times from the baby's father picking out a tune on his guitar. Later still, it came from the baby's grandfather calling the baby in. This is what this grandfather used to say, calling the baby in with sweet strains on his classical guitar. This calling music was so instrumental to the birthing that when, for a moment, Grandfather Paul stopped playing, Rach was shaken from her deep moaning meditative state within a contraction and urgently called to him, "No, don't stop, play. I can't do it without your music." Now, given that a birthing woman's request comes with the strength of a royal command that none of her subjects could possibly refuse, Grandfather Paul quickly resumed, and his music gave supportive accompaniment to her efforts. Being with Rach for her 3 babies, I've learned a lot about birth dancing. With each of her births, she has danced her way into and through contractions. Each baby has seen a different dance emerge. With this baby, the birth dance was light and sweeping. She danced her way around the lounge and kitchen, through contractions and in between. Also sometimes leaning on the kitchen table or against her partner or myself or her midwife, all of whom followed her movements, joining the dance as she choreographed. Then, moving deeper into her labour, Rachel's birth song reverberated around the room, part of the continuous singing of this song without end that circles the earth as women birth their sweet babies. Feel it at birth, don't you? Feel that.
Look at the
Eventually, the dance and song led her to the tub, where the deep guttural moans and groans of late labour swept her away into the rush and release of the birthing moments. Johnny received their baby through the water and passed him through to Rachel's loving embrace, witnessed by the new baby's grandparents, aunts, Rachel's good friend, and her 3 caregivers. Sacred moments of birth witnessed in quiet humility as mother, father, and new babe made their love bond. Not in sheer relief at the ordeal of labour being over, not in the desperation of imagined danger averted, not in the disconnected haze of passive acquiescence to procedures and practices designed to get the job done efficiently, but in the lovingness of their wish to honour, in full consciousness, the coming of a new birth and being into its life. There is a difference in quality here. It is the quality of deep human connection and the building of a circle of lovingness that can be felt as a palpable vibration by all within it. Wouldn't we want our babies to be welcomed into this?
so beautiful.
Mm.
I'm
Katie's crying.
Yeah.
What a privilege it is, huh?
I know.
Invited into those spaces.
Thank you, Rhea. Thank you. That has totally filled my cup, and I'm feeling full of oxytocin now. But I can't speak properly. And just that magic is, it's a privilege and a joy. And it's been a privilege to speak to you and hear your words of wisdom and knowledge. Thank you for being in this bubbling cauldron with us today.
Beautiful to be here with you.
I hope you found a few golden nuggety nuggets in the show today. Please don't press pause, but instead scroll on down on your podcast app. Yep, that's it, down there, and pop a review and maybe a few stars to make our eyes twinkle with glee. For more on breastfeeding and lactation content, head on over to my website where my course is. And for courses and books from Rachel, you can find everything in the links below. So all I gotta say now is, see you next time. And I can't wait.